Officer Garrett Clough never thought a routine traffic stop could trigger a nightmare that would stalk him every single night. He tormented an innocent man, crossed a boundary he didn't even realize was there, and now something dark and vindictive was coming for him while he slept. What happened next defies everything you think you know about justice and revenge. Each morning, Garrett woke up covered in bruises he couldn't account for. His body ached like he'd been in a fight, yet his bedroom door was locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses, just pain and terror. He thought he was losing his mind until he set up a camera and saw what was really happening in the darkness. The footage was so unsettling that even seasoned officers refused to watch it a second time. And when a spiritualist finally revealed who was behind it all, Garrett realized he was paying the price for destroying someone's life without a second thought. We appreciate you so much for being here with us today. Your support keeps these stories alive. Real quick, we'd love to know where you're tuning in from right now. Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and give us a like. We've got more jaw-dropping stories coming your way. Garrett had been on the force for 11 years. He knew every street corner in his district, every hiding spot where speeders thought they could get away. He was tough, direct, and never apologized for doing his job the way he saw fit. But 2 weeks ago, everything shifted in a way he couldn't explain or control. It started on a Tuesday morning. Garrett woke up with a dull ache in his ribs. He figured he'd slept wrong, or maybe pulled something at the gym the day before. He showered, got dressed, and went to work without thinking much about it. But the next morning, the pain was worse. When he looked in the mirror, he saw a dark purple bruise spreading across his left side. He pressed it gently and winced. It was fresh. It was real. By the end of the week, Garrett had bruises on both arms, across his chest, and along his back. He checked his bedroom for anything that could have caused it. The bed frame was sturdy, the walls were clear, there was nothing sharp or dangerous anywhere near where he slept. He lived alone in a small apartment on the 4th floor. The door was always locked. The windows were sealed. No one had access to his place except him. Garrett started keeping track. Every morning, new bruises appeared. Some were small, like fingerprints pressed too hard into his skin. Others were large and angry, the kind you'd get from being thrown against something solid. He felt exhausted all the time, like he wasn't really sleeping, even though he went to bed at the same time every night. His body was breaking down, and he had no idea why. He thought about seeing a doctor, but what would he even say? That he was waking up beaten and battered with no memory of how it happened? They'd think he was crazy or hiding something. Garrett wasn't the type to show vulnerability, especially not to strangers. So he kept it to himself and tried to make sense of it on his own. But deep down, a cold fear was growing. Something was happening to him in the night, something he couldn't see or fight back against, and it was getting worse. Garrett needed answers. He couldn't keep living like this, waking up in pain with no explanation. If something or someone was getting into his apartment while he slept, he had to find out. He decided to set up a camera, not the obvious kind that sits on a shelf, but a small hidden one that could record all night without being noticed. He stopped at an electronics store after his shift and bought a motion-activated night vision camera. The clerk asked what he needed it for. Garrett lied and said he thought someone was breaking into a storage unit. He didn't want anyone knowing the truth. He didn't want the guys at the station finding out that Officer Kossoff was afraid of his own bedroom. That evening, Garrett mounted the camera on top of his bookshelf, angling it toward his bed. He made sure it had a clear view of the entire room. He tested it twice to confirm it was recording properly. The red light blinked once and then disappeared. Perfect. If anything moved in that room tonight, he'd have proof. He climbed into bed around 11 p.m. His body was tense. Part of him hoped the camera would catch nothing, that maybe the bruises would stop on their own, and this whole nightmare would just fade away. But another part of him knew better. Whatever was happening wasn't going to stop until he confronted it. Garrett lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of traffic outside. His mind raced through possibilities. Maybe he was sleepwalking and hurting himself. Maybe there was a carbon monoxide leak messing with his brain. Maybe he was losing his mind and didn't even know it. Eventually, exhaustion pulled him under. His eyes closed, his breathing slowed, and somewhere in the deep hours of the night while Garrett Clough slept, the camera kept recording. When he woke up the next morning, the pain hit him immediately. His neck was stiff, his shoulders throbbed. He sat up slowly and looked down at his arms. Fresh bruises, darker than before. He touched one and felt the sting radiate through his skin. But this time, he wasn't afraid. This time, he had evidence. Garrett grabbed his laptop and pulled the memory card from the camera. His hands were shaking as he inserted it into the card reader. The file loaded slowly, and he clicked play. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m. The room was dark, except for the faint glow from the streetlight outside his window. He could see himself lying in bed, completely still. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. Garrett fast-forwarded, watching the timer tick by. 12:15 a.m., 12:30 a.m. on still nothing. He was about to skip ahead again when something on the screen made him freeze. At 1:47 a.m., the room on the footage seemed to turn icy, like the air itself had suddenly thinned. He could tell because his breath became visible in the footage, small clouds of vapor rising from his sleeping body. Then it appeared, a shadow in the corner of the room. It didn't walk in through the door or climb through the window. It simply materialized like smoke taking shape. The figure was tall and dark, its edges blurred and shifting. Garrett leaned closer to the screen, his pulse hammering in his ears. The figure moved toward the bed, slowly, deliberately. What happened next made Garrett's stomach turn. The figure raised one arm, and suddenly, his body on the screen lifted off the mattress. Not by much, maybe a foot or two, but he was suspended in midair for several seconds. Then the figure slammed him back down hard. Garrett watched his own body jerk from the impact, though he remained asleep, completely unaware. The dark figure circled the bed. It reached out and pressed down on his chest with invisible force. On the screen, Garrett's body twisted and convulsed, his arms flailing weakly as if trying to fight something off in his sleep. The figure struck him again and again, each blow landing with enough force to leave marks. This went on for nearly an hour, lifting him, dropping him, pressing him into the mattress. The figure showed no mercy and no hesitation, and through it all, Garrett remained unconscious, trapped in whatever nightmare his mind had created to make sense of the pain. At 2:52 a.m., the figure stopped. It stood at the foot of the bed for a long moment watching. Then it dissolved back into shadow and vanished completely. Garrett's body on the screen went still. The rest of the night passed without incident. Garrett sat back in his chair, his mouth dry and his mind reeling. He replayed the footage 3 more times, hoping he'd see something different, some logical explanation, but there was none. Something supernatural had entered his room and attacked him while he slept, and he had no idea how to stop it. Garrett didn't go to work that day. He called in sick and spent hours sitting on his couch, staring at nothing. The footage replayed in his mind over and over. He'd seen a lot in his years as a cop. Violence, crime, people at their absolute worst. But this was different. This wasn't something he could arrest or control. This was beyond anything he understood. He knew he couldn't handle this alone. He needed help from someone who dealt with things that existed outside the normal world. Garrett searched online for spiritualists in the area. He felt ridiculous typing the words into his phone, but desperation left him no choice. He found a woman named Celeste who claimed to specialize in spiritual disturbances and negative energies. Her office was in a small building downtown, tucked between a laundromat and a tattoo parlor. Garrett walked in and was greeted by the smell of incense and the sound of wind chimes. Celeste was in her 50s, dressed in flowing purple fabric with rings on every finger. She smiled warmly and invited him to sit. Garrett showed her the footage. She watched in silence, her expression neutral. When it ended, she looked at him and said he was dealing with a spiritual attack. She burned sage around him, chanted something in a language he didn't recognize, and gave him a small pouch filled with herbs. She told him to keep it under his pillow, and the attacks would stop. Garrett paid her $200 and left feeling uneasy. That night, he placed the pouch under his pillow and went to bed. The camera was still recording. When he woke up the next morning, his body was covered in new bruises. The pouch had done nothing. He found a second spiritualist named Brother Malcolm, who worked out of a church basement. Malcolm listened to Garrett's story, prayed over him for 30 minutes, and splashed him with holy water. He gave Garrett a blessed candle and told him to light it before bed every night. Malcolm promised it would create a protective barrier that no dark force could cross. Garrett tried it. He lit the candle and watched it flicker in the darkness before finally falling asleep. But when morning came, the bruises were still there, worse than before. The candle had burned down to nothing, and the attacks had continued just the same. 2 spiritualists, 2 failures. Garrett was running out of options and running out of hope. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Garrett found the 3rd spiritualist through a co-worker who'd heard about someone with a real gift. Her name was Diana Hobbes, and she didn't advertise online or have a fancy office. She worked from her home in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town. Garrett called ahead, and she agreed to see him that same afternoon. When he arrived, Diana Hobbes opened the door before he could knock. She was an older woman with gray hair, pulled back in a tight bun, and eyes that seemed to look straight through him. She didn't smile or offer pleasantries. She just stepped aside and let him in. Her living room was simple. A few chairs, a wooden table, candles burning low on the windowsill. She sat across from Garrett and told him to explain everything. He showed her the footage on his laptop. She watched without blinking, her face calm and focused. When it ended, she closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair. Diana Hobbes asked him a question that caught him off guard. She wanted to know if he'd wronged someone recently, someone he'd hurt or disrespected in a way that left them angry and powerless. Garrett's mind went blank at first. He'd dealt with dozens of people in the past few weeks. Arrests, traffic stops, arguments. It was part of the job. But then she pressed harder. She told him this wasn't random. The dark figure wasn't a demon or a ghost. It was someone's will made manifest. Someone who knew exactly who Garrett was and wanted him to suffer for what he'd done. She asked again, who had he wronged? And then it hit him. 2 weeks ago, the traffic stop, the man who wouldn't back down. Garrett's chest tightened as the memory came flooding back. He'd pulled over a driver for a broken taillight. The man had been calm and respectful at first, but when Garrett started pushing him around and making accusations, the man stood his ground. He quoted the law back at Garrett, told him he had no right to search the vehicle without probable cause. It made Garrett furious. He hated being challenged, especially by someone who thought they were smarter than him. So Garrett arrested him. He made up charges, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct. None of it was true, but Garrett didn't care. When the man tried to protest, Garrett used force. He grabbed him, shoved him against the car, and wrestled him to the ground. The man fought back just enough to protect himself, and in the struggle, he hit the pavement hard. Garrett remembered seeing the scrapes and bruises forming on the man's arms and face as he cuffed him. The man didn't say much after that. He just stared at Garrett with a look that felt like ice, cold, focused, unforgetting. Diana Hobbes nodded slowly as Garrett finished telling her. She said the man's name without Garrett ever mentioning it. Vincent Mayberry. Garrett's blood ran cold. She told him Vincent was no ordinary man. He practiced old magic, the kind passed down through generations. And when someone wronged him the way Garrett had, Vincent didn't forgive. He made them pay. Garrett sat in silence as the weight of the truth settled over him. Vincent Mayberry. He remembered the name now from the arrest report he'd filed that night. He remembered the way Vincent had looked at him before being dragged into the patrol car. There was no fear in his eyes, just certainty, like he already knew how this would end. The traffic stop had seemed routine at first. Garrett had been patrolling a quiet street just after sunset when he noticed the car with a broken tail light. He pulled Vincent over and approached the window with his usual confidence. Vincent handed over his license and registration without hesitation. Everything was in order. Clean record, valid insurance. There was no reason to take it further. But Garrett had been having a bad day. His supervisor had chewed him out earlier for a report he'd filed incorrectly. He was tired and irritated and looking for someone to take it out on. When Vincent asked why he was being detained longer than necessary, Garrett didn't like the tone. He ordered Vincent out of the car. Vincent complied, but he didn't stay quiet. He told Garrett he had no legal grounds to search his vehicle. He cited specific statutes and case law, speaking calmly and clearly like someone who'd studied his rights. That only made Garrett angrier. He wasn't used to people talking back to him, especially not with that kind of confidence. Garrett accused Vincent of being confrontational. He said Vincent was acting suspicious and refused to cooperate. None of it was true, but Garrett didn't care about the truth in that moment. He cared about control. He grabbed Vincent by the arm and told him he was under arrest. Vincent pulled away, not to escape, but to protect himself from being manhandled. That was all the excuse Garrett needed. He forced Vincent to the ground, pressing his knee into his back while reaching for the handcuffs. Vincent struggled just enough to keep his face from hitting the pavement too hard, but Garrett used more force than necessary. He twisted Vincent's arm behind his back and shoved him down harder. Vincent's cheek scraped against the rough asphalt. His elbow hit the curb. When Garrett finally pulled him to his feet, there were visible marks on his skin, bruises forming on his arms, a cut above his eyebrow. Vincent didn't cry out or beg. He just looked at Garrett with that same cold stare. Garrett threw him in the back of the patrol car and drove him to the station. The charges were processed. Vincent was released hours later after posting bail. Garrett never thought about him again after that night. It was just another arrest and a long line of arrests. Just another phase he'd forget by the end of the week. But Vincent hadn't forgotten. And now, sitting in Diana Hobbes' living room, Garrett realized he'd made an enemy far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Diana Hobbes let the silence hang for a moment before she spoke again. She told Garrett that Vincent had used astral projection to reach him. His spirit left his body every night and traveled to Garrett's apartment to deliver punishment for what had been done to him. The bruises Vincent received during the arrest were now being returned to Garrett night after night until the debt was paid or until Garrett's body gave out completely. Garrett felt his throat tighten. He asked if there was any way to stop it. Diana Hobbes studied him carefully, as if weighing whether he deserved her help. She told him that Vincent's magic was powerful and rooted in justified anger. Breaking it wouldn't be easy, and it would require Garrett to do something he probably wasn't used to doing. He'd have to humble himself. She explained the steps clearly. First, Garrett needed to write a letter to Vincent. Not an email or a text, but a handwritten letter of genuine apology. He had to acknowledge exactly what he'd done wrong, admit that the arrest was unjust, and take full responsibility for the harm he caused. The letter had to be sincere. Vincent would know if it wasn't. Second, Garrett had to leave an offering at a Crossroads at midnight. Diana Hobbes gave him a list of items: a white candle, a bottle of olive oil, 3 coins, a piece of cloth torn from something Garrett owned. He was to place them at the center of the Crossroads, light the candle, and speak Vincent's name 3 times while asking for release from the curse. Third, and most important, Garrett had to change. Diana Hobbes made it clear that the ritual would only work if Garrett truly meant to be different going forward. If he went back to his old ways, treating people with cruelty and abusing his power, the protection would fade, and something worse than Vincent's spirit might come for him next time. Garrett nodded slowly. He didn't argue or make excuses. For the first time in a long time, he felt the full weight of what he'd done. He destroyed an innocent man's dignity because of his own ego. He'd used his badge as a weapon instead of a tool for justice. And now he was paying the price in ways he never thought possible. Diana Hobbes handed him a small pouch containing protective herbs and told him to keep it with him until the ritual was complete. She warned him that Vincent's attacks might intensify in the next few nights, as if sensing that Garrett was trying to break free. He needed to move quickly. Garrett thanked her and left with the instructions burned into his memory. He had one chance to make this right. He wasn't going to waste it. Garrett went home and sat at his kitchen table with a pen and a blank sheet of paper. Writing the letter was harder than he expected. He'd never been good at apologizing, and putting his shame into words felt like pulling teeth. But he forced himself to do it. He wrote about the traffic stop. He admitted he'd lied about the charges. He confessed that he'd used unnecessary force and hurt Vincent without cause. He ended the letter by saying he was sorry and that he understood if Vincent never forgave him. He sealed the letter in an envelope and addressed it to Vincent Mayberry. He planned to mail it the next morning. That night, Garrett gathered the items Diana Hobbes had listed: a white candle from the grocery store, olive oil from his kitchen cabinet, 3/4 from his wallet, a strip of fabric he tore from an old uniform shirt. He placed everything in a bag and waited for midnight. When the time came, Garrett drove to the nearest crossroads on the outskirts of town. The streets were empty, the air was cold and still. He stepped out of his car and walked to the center where the two roads met. He arranged the items carefully, just as Diana Hobbes had instructed. He lit the candle and watched the flame flicker in the darkness. Garrett spoke Vincent's name 3 times. His voice was steady but quiet. He asked to be released from the curse. He asked for forgiveness. He promised to be better. The candle burned for a moment longer, then went out on its own, even though there was no wind. Garrett stood there in the silence, unsure if it had worked, but something inside him felt different, lighter. He went home and climbed into bed. The camera was still set up, still recording. Garrett closed his eyes and waited. For the first time in 2 weeks, he made it through the entire night without waking even once. When morning came, he opened his eyes slowly. His body didn't hurt. There were no new bruises. He checked the footage and saw nothing but himself, sleeping peacefully from start to finish. The curse was broken. Vincent had accepted the apology, or at least decided Garrett had suffered enough. Either way, it was over. Garrett mailed the letter that afternoon. He didn't know if Vincent would read it or throw it away, but it didn't matter. He'd done what needed to be done. Over the following weeks, Garrett changed the way he worked. He stopped looking for reasons to escalate situations. He treated people with respect, even when they challenged him. He remembered what it felt like to be powerless, and made sure he never made anyone else feel that way again. The night terrors never return. But Garrett never forgot the lesson. Some debts can't be paid with money or time. Some debts are paid with pain, humility, and the choice to become someone better. And sometimes, justice comes from places we never expect. So, what do you think? Do people deserve second chances after abusing their power? Or should consequences be permanent? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story made you think twice about how we treat each other, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that will leave you speechless. We'll see you in the next one.